Hey everybody, this is part 3 of Sean Matgamna's introduction to his edited volume, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Text of Critical Marxism, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism. Here we go. The part is titled The Orthodox and the Heterodox After the War. First section is titled The Orthodox After the War. By April 1946, Max Shachtman could comment, quote, "It is hard to find anyone in the Fourth International who will today offer with any measure of conviction an argument in favor of, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of Stalinist Russia. Many of the Trotskyist militants in this country and elsewhere who opposed us vigorously in 1940 are today abandoning this outlived and now reactionary slogan," end quote. The Second Congress of the Fourth International in April 1948 would officially amend the slogan to the ambiguous and open-ended, quote, defense of what remains of the conquest of October, end quote. Quote, "Others go further in our direction," end quote, wrote Shachtman, quote, "by abandoning the preposterous theory that Russia today represents any kind of, quote, workers' state," end quote. The quote, workers' state, end quote, theory, in whose demolition we are proud to have pioneered, is dying in the Fourth International, and there is pretty nearly nobody around with enough belief in it to try to save it, end quote. But there was no conscious, open, and clear-cut self-correction. The minorities in the Orthodox Trotskyist groups in the USA, parenthesis, Albert Goldman and Felix Marot, in parenthesis, in France and in other countries who did slough off the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, formula and did openly attempt at self-correction were demagogically beaten down with charges of, quote, revisionism, end quote, and dispersed. The Trotskyist groups had grown around the end of the World War, but then from 1947 the political climate turned very unfavorable for Trotskyists of all stripes. It's just a side note to myself. I'm very interested. It would be a very interesting piece to have like a piece that's just about this Second Congress and all the people that were there. There probably is something out there. Because all the different people, Muniz, Castoriadis, Johnson Forrest, all kinds of people would have been attending this Congress with different theories of the USSR. Obviously, the ones that are not degenerated worker state in character would have been in the minority. But something that I'm really curious about, that someone should enlighten me about, and I don't know who would, I can't think of any people who would have like access to information. I'm very interested, like, what was the relationship between Ivan Crepieu and the Castoriadis before tendency, because in France, Ivan Crepieu, at least formally, obviously he's not the only one, but formally tried to, actually there's other people, that's not true, he shouldn't be excluded, but he's like one of the people who put forward a bureaucratic collectivist thesis very early on, and the early Castoriadis and Lafort kind of they didn't use the term bureaucratic collectivist, but they refused to call the USSR any type of capitalism. But I'm just very curious about the relationship of those people. And I've said this before in other videos, but I'm very sure because I think there was alliances made, right, between different people who critiqued the the degenerated worker state thesis. Like, I think there was some kind of, like, at least a quasi, or at least they signed like a joint statement or something to the effect that different people did, like Muniz and Castoriadis and Shachtman, on different motions. They all lost, of course, but very, very interesting period in intellectual and political history. But there is no conscious, open, and clear-cut self-correction. The minorities in the Orthodox Trotskyist groups in the USA, Goldman, Marot, in France, and other countries who did slough off the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, formula and did openly attempt self-correction were demagogically beaten down with charges of, quote, revisionism, end quote, and dispersed. The Trotskyist groups had grown around the end of the World War, but then from 1947 the political climate turned very unfavorable for Trotskyists of all stripes. The April 1948 Second Congress of the Fourth International defined the East European satellite states as capitalist police states. There, in effect, the Orthodox gave the same answer as the James Dunayevskaya segment of the Workers' Party, who had given in its definition of the USSR as a fascist state capitalism. If state capitalism, rather than, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, or, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, was true for Russia's satellites, then it was true for the USSR too. Fetishization of the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, term for Russia kept them from saying or seeing that. The sorting out would come in the wake of another startling shift. Exactly 68 days after the close of the Second Congress, a split between Stalin and Tito-Stalinists ruling Yugoslavia, the Tito-Stalinists ruling Yugoslavia, became public, complete with mutual vituperation. Untypically among the European Stalinist regimes, the Yugoslavs, at the head of a peasant army during the World War, had taken and held power without any important help from Stalin's army. Just a few days after the public Tito-Stalin split, the Fourth International, which had very recently characterized Yugoslavia as a capitalist police state, that is, some sort of fascistic state, wrote an open letter to the Yugoslav Communist Party addressing the YCP leaders as, quote, comrades, end quote. It offered, quote, to assist, bracket, them, end bracket, in resolving the present crisis in communism along proletarian and Leninist lines, end quote. Within the next year, they would, most of them, decide that the other satellite states, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, East Germany, North Korea, were also, quote, deformed workers' states, end quote, and should be, quote, defended, end quote. The long gestation of full-blown post-Trotsky, quote, Orthodox Trotskyism, end quote, was nearly over. The political changes had become qualitative. This was a new political tendency, a hybrid combining strands of Trotskyism, as Trotsky had it, of pre-1933 Trotskyism, and of the 1930s, quote, right communist, end quote, opposition of Heinrich Brandler, J. Lovestone, and others who advocated reform, not revolution, for Russia. The difference between the Orthodox Trotskyists, as their doctrine solidified in 1949 to 51, and Trotsky was vast. The difference between them and the Workers' Party, parenthesis, the Independent Socialist League, from 25th of April 1949, end parenthesis, was now one of two radically different world outlooks. The Orthodox Trotskyists' jump on Yugoslavia and Eastern Europe ate into everything else in their politics. On Yugoslavia and then China, then North Vietnam, then a decade and a half later Cuba, the Orthodox jumped back explicitly to the, quote, reform, end quote, Trotskyism before the movement's decision in 1933 that a new, quote, political, end quote, revolution was necessary in Russia, and to the, quote, reform, end quote, Trotskyism, to which they had reverted implicitly and erratically during World War II in relation to the USSR. It would be 20 years after Mao conquered all of China before the Fourth International decided that a, quote, political revolution, end quote, was necessary. Parenthesis, the Socialist Workers' Party USA had been for a, quote, political revolution, end quote, from as soon as it decided that China was a, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, in 1955, later than the rest of the Fourth International, end parenthesis. So the USA was a little more, the U.S. Socialist Party, Workers' Party was more critical of China than the Fourth International in general, I guess. The new reformism vis-a-vis some Stalinist states was not the old, quote, reformism, end quote. The pre-1933 Trotskyist, quote, reformism, end quote, meant orienting to the elements of the Bolshevik Party, assumed to be still a force despite Stalin's destruction of party functioning, and still loyal to the ideals of the 1917 Workers' Revolution. In a sharp crisis of the system which the Trotskyists expected to come, and very soon all those elements would be shaken up. The party would recompose itself, its functioning would be restored, and the bureaucracy could be sloughed off. There was no equivalent agency in the new, quote, reformist Trotskyism, end quote. It was a matter of advocating reform for states identical in structure to the Russian state in its fully Stalinized post-counter-revolution condition. In some instances, the reform proposals were addressed as advice to the rulers in the style of 19th century utopian socialist petitioning governments. Yet those who had taken and held power in those states had done so at the head of totalitarian parties and armies that were not working class in their membership or in any Marxist sense at all. The Yugoslav Communist Party did loosen up its totalitarian rule after 1948, and the Yugoslav Communist Party made some reforms. But they went nowhere near allowing the existence of a workers' movement or independent communist organizations. After 1950 to 51, the Yugoslav Communist Party would back the United Nations (US-led) forces in the Korean War, while the Orthodox Trotskyists backed the North Koreans and their Russian and Chinese sponsors. The Yugoslav Stalinists would eventually denounce the Orthodox Trotskyist Fourth International, which had loudly backed them against Stalin and organized international work brigades to go and help build roads in Yugoslavia for being too soft on ... Russian Stalinism. Very interesting. In Czechoslovakia, the Communist Party had been a mass working-class party before the Nazis took power. The final act in creating a full replica of Stalinist Russia in February 1948 was a grim parody of a workers' revolution, in its way something new in Stalinism. Working-class demonstrations, strikes, and other activities were staged and regimented by the Stalinists who had long before acquired real state power as a gift from Moscow. The militant assessed the Stalinist action as a victory of Czech capitalism. Quote, Stalinists utilized mass pressure to make deal with Czech capitalists, end quote. Parenthesis, 8th of March 1948, end parenthesis. In all the world, only one Trotskyist organization thought the Stalinist action in Czechoslovakia was good and desirable. The Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain welcomed the Stalinist action in Czechoslovakia in an article in its Socialist Appeal, parenthesis, March 1948, end parenthesis, signed by the Revolutionary Communist Party Secretary Jock Haston, quote, capitalists routed in Czechoslovakia, end quote. Such was the political chaos that would grip the Fourth International that the people who published that article would also make valid criticisms of the delusions about Yugoslavia which the other Orthodox Trotskyists held from July 1948. In June 1950, Stalinist North Korea invaded the bourgeois South. It was acting as Russia's proxy. After December 1950, large Chinese armies fought in Korea. The U.S. and the U.S.'s allies, including Britain, responded to the June 1950 invasion with full-scale war, for which they got the backing of the United Nations, since Russia had temporarily quit the Security Council. The Socialist Workers' Party at first responded with a, quote, third camp, end quote, stance. Quote, let the Korean people decide their own fate free from U.S. or Kremlin, end quote. Parenthesis, the militant 3rd of July 1950, end parenthesis. Here, too, as at the start of the USA's war in December 1941, James P. Cannon took some weeks to decide what he thought. But then, with an open letter to the President and Congress, parenthesis, 31st of July, end parenthesis, Cannon threw the Orthodox Trotskyists behind the Stalinists. Cannon simply redefined the political picture, fading out the Stalinist dimension in Korea. It was not Stalinism, but the Korean Revolution, part of the worldwide colonial revolution that confronted the USA and the USA's allies. The technique was familiar from the political performance of the Orthodox during the World War. It was a further turning point in consolidating the new orthodoxy. In following 3 years up to Stalin's death in March 1953, the Fourth International would elaborate a worldview that expanded the idea of war revolution that had exercised the Dan Mensheviks, the Socialist Workers' Party, and some European Trotskyists in 1943 to 45. World War III, which many people far from Trotskyism then expected too, would be an international class war. In it, the European mass Stalinist parties would rally to the USSR and lead revolutionary mobilizations as the Russian army marched across Europe to the Atlantic. The Stalinist-led forces would establish systems and regimes similar to those of the East European satellites and the USSR itself. This would be the next, quote, albeit, quote, deformed, end quote, stage of the world's socialist revolution. The Orthodox Trotskyists were its advocates by way of their, quote, perspectives and, quote, predictions and orientations, which in Europe included entry into the big and authoritarian Stalinist parties of Western Europe. This new, quote, war revolution, end quote, perspective differed from that of the Socialist Workers' Party in 1943 to 45. it had never been sufficiently clear whether the, quote, red, end quote, army, or workers roused by it, would make the revolution, but the Socialist Workers' Party had talked of the, quote, red, end quote, army, stimulating working-class revolutionary movements that it would not be able to control or repress, and indeed would not want to control or repress even if ordered to. There was none of that in the 1950-53 war revolution thesis. The result would not be socialist revolutions beyond the power of Stalin to quell, as the 1943-45 line had it, but Stalinist states set up by the, quote, red, end quote, army, with more or less local support. The Fourth International's main leader, Michel Pablo, even wrote speculatively of, quote, centuries, end quote, of Stalinist and semi-Stalinist deformed worker states. Parenthesis, quote, this is the piece, Where Are We Going? Socialist Workers' Party International Information Bulletin, March 1951, end parenthesis. New section, The Revenge of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. In his speculation about Stalinist states covering much or all of the world for, quote, centuries, end quote, Pablo came close to defining the Stalinist states as, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. That is, states of a substantial new type of ruling class. It was what Trotsky had outlined hypothetically in 1939 as a global slave society, but now reevaluated as the first wave of socialist revolution. Curiously, Pablo, who separated from the Fourth International in 1963, by the late 1960s had come explicitly to call the Stalinist systems bureaucratic class states. Pablo remained a, quote, defensist, end quote, against capitalist imperialism for those states. In that, Pablo merely brought his own publicly expressed half-thoughts of the early 1950s to their logical conclusion. A number of, quote, anti-Pabloite, end quote, Orthodox Trotskyists took an essentially similar course, disguising it from themselves in the idea that, quote, deformed worker states, end quote, were so sharply distinct from, quote, worker states, end quote, that the, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, was a separate stage in history, not necessarily connected to working class action, parenthesis, and therefore should not be accommodated to it in the way that Pablo had accommodated to it around 1950, end parenthesis. These were, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, ideas in an ill-fitting, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, shell, advocated, for example, by the Grant tendency, reference to Ted Grant in the UK, parenthesis, militant, the Socialist Party, Socialist Appeal, end parenthesis, and the once noisy Spartacists. Quote, worker state, end quote, in this version of, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, doctrine, signified nothing about the relation of the state to workers and nothing at all but an encoded expression of approval. The only difference on the level of basic theory between this sort of, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, doctrine and the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, idea of the Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League was a difference of political attitude and of historical evaluation, an attitude of, quote, defending, end quote, and lauding and helping along the expansion of Stalinism, parenthesis, because it was historically progressive, end parenthesis, as against the Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League's horrified rejection of it, parenthesis, as a historically regressive totalitarian tyranny, end parenthesis. And in that rejection, the Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League, and not the Orthodox, were the Trotskyists. A sizable section of the Pablo Mandel International, the Latin American Bureau, split away in 1962, led by Juan Posadas. Advocacy of the, quote, demand, end quote, that Russia and China start the war revolution came to be one of their central policies. The other Orthodox Trotskyists said that the Posadas group was deranged, and it surely was. When Hal Draper defined the Orthodox Trotskyist Fourth International of the early 1950s as, quote, borderline crackpot, end quote, he erred, if he erred, on the side of restraint and mealy-mouthedness. The great expansionary wave of Stalinism that ran from the 1940s until it broke in Afghanistan in Russia's colonial wars of the 1980s was revolutionary against the bourgeoisie. but also counter-revolutionary against the working class and against all elements of bourgeois democracy and political liberty. That is, against much of the historical achievements of bourgeois civilization over centuries, not to speak of socialism. The Stalinist revolutions were in no sense or degree working-class revolutions. Under them, the working classes were the immediate victim of repression, labor movements of extirpation, Trotskyists simply of murder. They had none of the characteristics that had led Trotsky to believe that Russia remained some kind of degenerated and degenerating worker state. Thus, in their own way, the Orthodox Trotskyists had arrived at a theory of what Trotsky had described in its future projection as, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. While yet rejecting the term for Russia and other Stalinist states, they rejected the suggestions which Trotsky had given from reviewing the class character of the USSR in the light of events in World War II, as they had, quote, suspended, end quote, his, parenthesis, and their own, end parenthesis, program of political revolution for much of the war. They developed a concept of, quote, deformed workers' state, end quote, that was a new theory of a new form of society connected only by thin verbal formulae to Trotsky's theory of Russia as a, quote, degenerated workers state, end quote. To me. They developed a concept of, quote, deformed worker state, end quote, that was a new theory of a new form of society connected only by thin verbal formulae to Trotsky's theory of Russia as a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. Trotsky made a well-known joke that even though James Burnham did not recognize the dialectic recognized Burnham. The Orthodox Trotskyists refused to recognize any variant of the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, but the theory in a thin disguise and with pro-Stalinist politics recognized and took possession of the Orthodox Trotskyist. The Orthodox became political satellites of the Stalinist bloc in world affairs, outspokenly so from 1950 in the Korean War. They did not become uncritical supporters of either the foreign or, parenthesis, most of, end parenthesis, the domestic policy of Stalinists in power. For the, quote, autonomous, end quote, Stalinist states, those not set up by the Russian army, they did as the Socialist Workers' Party had done in 1941 with its, quote, minimum program, end quote, for defense of the USSR. They advocated, quote, reforms, end quote, that would have amounted to a revolution. As in the pioneering model in 1941, these, quote, demands, end quote, had their head and executive organs lopped off. The demands, which of course were a form of propaganda in the Orthodox Trotskyist press, aimed at their own milieu, were separated off from the necessary conclusion, a workers' revolution. On one level, they were advice to the rulers to cut off their own horns, claws, and tails. They were a species of utopian socialism. James P. Cannon, who was in some ways always better or trying to be better than the movement he had educated and miseducated, made a confused revolt in 1953 against some of the trends that the Orthodox Fourth International developed around the ideas of the August-September 1951 Third World Congress. Cannon split the Orthodox Fourth International, accusing the Pablo Mandel leadership of conciliation with Stalinism, of failing to support the East German workers when they rose in 1953 with demands that the Russian army, which was shooting them, should withdraw from Germany, and of liquidating the small independent Trotskyist groups into the big Stalinist parties. Cannon was in part driven by an internal Socialist Workers' Party faction fight with people who claimed to be acting, quote, for Pablo, end quote. And Cannon explicitly refused to, quote, go back to 1940, end quote, or even to the Third Congress of 1951. When one of his comrades, Sam Gordon, argued in a private letter that what Cannon denounced was rooted in the positions of the Third Congress, Cannon responded that they should recognize no major errors as having been made by the Third Congress or themselves. Prestige and calculation of factional advantage ruled then, as they had since Trotsky's death, and always would. Prestige and calculation of factional advantage ruled then, as they had since Trotsky's death, and always would. It's not in italics, I'm just repeating it because it seems important. The consequence for the, quote, anti-Pabloite, end quote, segment of the Fourth International was that they arbitrarily asserted their own picture of reality, as they had during World War II, and didn't bother too much with logic, theories, the recent past, or the implications of positions taken or not taken. They cut loose from the theorizing of the Third Congress and of Pablo, as earlier from that of Trotsky. Those who sided with Cannon in 1953, the British Helyites and French Lambertists, would evolve into the worst regime-ridden, undemocratic, and irrational organizations in the Trotskyist archipelago. In 1979, the Socialist Workers' Party itself went the same way, transformed by its own party machine under new control. It soon expelled almost all the older Orthodox Trotskyists and transformed the regime into a semi-Stalinist sect rigidly aligned with the Castro regime in Cuba. That was not a matter of political logic only, or of the habit of establishing a political line for short-term advantage. It could happen, only because the organizations of the 1953 Cannonite, quote, International Committee of the Fourth International, end quote, were under the control of strong bureaucratic machines. When the Socialist Workers' Party and the Mandel grouping reunited in 1963, minus Pablo, the Helyites and Lambertists rejected the reunification and went into their own increasingly bizarre ways. In 1967, the Helyites came out for Mao's Cultural Revolution, a debauch of wild physical and intellectual wrecking and destruction by, quote, Red Guard and, quote, youth controlled by the Maoist army. The mainstream, quote, Orthodox Trotskyists, end quote, with Mandel zigzagged wildly, playing political chameleon to many other political tendencies, Stalinist and non-Stalinist. In the 1950s and most of the 1960s, they operated as factions inside social democratic parties and official communist parties. Then in the late 1960s and 1970s, they grew into sizable organizations, usually ultra-left, in a number of countries. From the 1980s, they generally declined. After the collapse of Stalinism in Europe and the USSR in 1991, they officially declared that their, quote, deformed workers' state, end quote, post-capitalist society, or, quote, transitional society, end quote, description of Stalinism must be critically reviewed. Their well-known writer, Daniel Ben-Said, explicitly repudiated all those formulas. Their summary of their adjustment after 1991 was, however, quote, new epoch, new program, new party, end quote, which in practice means they have become proponents of building ill-defined, quote, broad left, end quote, parties, rather than of parties of the type advocated and built by Lenin and Trotsky. In Britain, their small group attached itself to George Galloway's ill-born and ill-fated, quote, Respect Party, end quote. Wikipedia says Daniel Ben-Said lived from 1946 to 2010 and was a French philosopher and leader of the Trotskyist movement in France. He became a leading figure in the student revolt in 1968 while studying at the University of Paris 10, Nanterre. Where am I? And we all know who George Galloway is, but I'm going to read his Wikipedia intro anyway. God, he looks like such an idiot. Anyway, George Galloway, born 1954, is a British politician, broadcaster, and writer. He has been leader of the Workers' Party of Britain since he founded it in 2019 and was former leader of the Respect Party. Until 2003, George Galloway was a member of the Labour Party. From 1987 to 2010, from 2012 to 2015, and briefly in 2024, Galloway served as Member of Parliament for 5 constituencies. George Galloway was born in Dundee, Scotland. After becoming the youngest ever chair of the Scottish Labour Party in 1981, Galloway was General Secretary of the charity War on Want from 1983 until his election for MP for Glasgow Hillhead. At the 1987 general election, Galloway was re-elected 3 times. Galloway was expelled from the Labour Party in 2003 due to his prominent opposition to the Iraq War. Galloway joined the Respect Party in 2004 and was its leader from 2013 to 2016. Galloway was elected as MP for Bethnal Green and Bow at the 2005 general election. After losing in the neighbouring constituency of Poplar and Limehouse at the 2010 general election, George Galloway regained a parliamentary seat at the 2012 Bradford West by-election, only to lose it at the 2015 general election. George Galloway unsuccessfully stood as an independent candidate at the 2017 and 2019 general elections. Galloway then founded the Workers' Party of Britain and stood unsuccessfully for the party at the 2021 Batley and Spen by-election. Galloway won the 2024 Rochdale by-election. Galloway lost the seat at the 2024 general election. Galloway describes himself as a socialist and socially conservative. It's embarrassing. Galloway traveled to Iraq to meet government officials in the 1990s. Galloway caused controversy by praising Saddam Hussein at a 1994 meeting, which he denied. Galloway founded the Miriam Appeal in 1998 to campaign against sanctions on Iraq. Galloway was accused of receiving illicit payments from Iraq's government, partly from money diverted from the United Nations Oil for Food program, defending himself as a 2005 United States Senate hearing. A staunch critic of Israel and of Zionism, Galloway supports the Palestinians in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and was involved in the 2009 Viva Palestina aid convoys to the Gaza Strip. In 2014, Galloway sustained injuries after being attacked by a Jewish convert due to his position on Israel. Galloway supported Jeremy Corbyn in his leadership of the Labour Party. In 2016, Galloway campaigned for the UK to leave the European Union after supporting Nigel Farage's Brexit Party at the 2019 European Parliament election. Galloway opposes Scottish independence and founded the British Unionist Alliance for All for Unity, which received 0.9% of votes at the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections. More recently, Galloway has blamed the Russian invasion of the Ukraine on the West. George Galloway hosted the Hal Draper, who had disputed with Shachtman over Cuba, produced scholarly books of great value. Some of Draper's young co-thinkers linked up with the British Independent International Socialist (forerunner of the Socialist Workers' Party) and acted as revolutionary socialists where they could. Despite a dispersal in 1976-7, when pressure from the British International Socialists for greater control broke the American group into half a dozen splinters, they continued to do that. But on the whole, the heterodox Trotskyist current had withered to very little by the time of the revolutionary left revived in the late 1960s, and its legacy has had to be rediscovered in libraries rather than being passed on directly through living political organizations. If the outlook of the heterodox was aridly chaste and truth-centered, that of the orthodox was full of sloppy political and historical fantasies, delusions, and adulterations, and it was polluted by promiscuous association with reactionary regimes. The Orthodox had the weight of Trotsky's authority on their side. They presented their ideas about Stalinism as the only consistent development from Trotsky's, in fact very different, and ideas. Trotsky's, in fact very different ideas. And the Orthodox survived for the same reason that the Stalinists survived. The Stalinist parties were Stalinist even when their politics were bourgeois conformists. In Britain, for instance, they were against the Labour Party leaving its coalition with the Tories in May 1945. Even after Labour had won the general election in July 1945, the Communist Tories advocated a new coalition that would include the Tories. Even Labour's right wing was to the left of this Stalinist party! What made the Communist Party Stalinist and prevented its sometimes bourgeois conformist politics leading to full conciliation with the bourgeoisie was that its core commitment was to the Russian Stalinist state. That kept it in the orbit of Russia and at odds with the local bourgeoisie, no matter how much the Stalinists became mired in the local bourgeoisie's politics. So too with the Orthodox Trotskyists. Their, quote, defensism, end quote, kept them from recoiling from Stalinism towards bourgeois democracy. The heterodox had no such moorings. 1,700 years ago, Catholic Christianity fought for supremacy with Arian Christianity. What the fuck is that? Or Arian Christianity. How am I saying this?
Aryan.
Oh, it is pronounced Aryan. Alright. 1,700 years ago, Catholic Christianity fought for supremacy with Arian Christianity. Oh shit, I forgot to look up Arian Christianity. Arianism is a Christological doctrine considered heretical by all modern mainstream branches of Christianity. It is first attributed to Arius, who lived from 256 to 336 AD, a Christian presbyter who preached and studied in Alexandria, Egypt. Arian theology holds that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, who was begotten by God the Father, with the difference that the Son of God did not always exist, but was begotten/made before time by God the Father. Therefore, Jesus was not co-eternal with God the Father, but nonetheless Jesus began to exist outside of time. Arius's Trinitarian theology, later given in extreme form by Aetius and his disciple Eunomius, and called Anomoian, quote, dissimilar, end quote, asserts a total dissimilarity between the Son and the Father. Arianism holds that the Son is distinct from the Father and therefore subordinate to the Father. What the term Arian is derived from is the name Arius. It was not what the followers of Arius's teachings called themselves, but rather a term used by outsiders. The nature of Arius's and his supporters' teachings were opposed to the theological doctrines by Homoousian Christians regarding the nature of the Trinity and the nature of Christ. There's a controversy between two interpretations of Jesus' divinity, parenthesis, Homoousianism and Arianism, and parenthesis, Homoousianism and Arianism, based upon the theological orthodoxy of the time, one Trinitarian and the other also a derivative of Trinitarian orthodoxy, and each of them attempted to solve its respective theological dilemmas. The Homoousianism was formally affirmed by the first two ecumenical councils. Since then, Arianism has been condemned as, quote, the heresy or sect of Arius, end quote. Trinitarian Homoousian doctrines were vigorously upheld by Patriarch Athanasius of Alexandria, who insisted that Jesus, parenthesis, God the Son, end parenthesis, was, quote, same in being, end quote, or, quote, same in essence, end quote, with God the Father. Arius stated, quote, if the Father begat the Son, then he who was begotten had a beginning in existence, and from this it follows there was a time when the Son was not, end quote. The ecumenical First Council of Nicaea of 325 declared Arianism to be a heresy. According to Everett Ferguson, quote, the great majority of Christians had no clear views about the nature of the Trinity, and they did not understand what was at stake in the issues that surrounded it, end quote. Arianism is also used to refer to other non-Trinitarian theological systems of the 4th century, which regarded Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Logos, as either a begotten creature of a similar or different substance to that of the Father, but not identical, parenthesis, as Homoousian and Anomoeanism, or as neither uncreated nor created in the sense other beings are created, as in semi-Arianism. Back to the text. 1700 years ago, Catholic Christianity fought for supremacy with Arian Christianity. The Arians were rational for their times, severely sensible, impatient with such ideas as that Jesus was God. The Catholics dealt in intellectual gibberish like the Trinity, the idea that God is both three persons in one. The Catholics absorbed pagan cults and worshipped local pagan gods as Christian saints. But the Catholics' myths and monkish fantasies catered for emotional and other needs in their congregations that the Arians could not cater for or hope to satisfy. The Heterodox were the Arians, and the Orthodox the Catholics, the post-Trotsky Trotskyism. The quote Catholic and quote Orthodox, by virtue of the Orthodox fudging of issues and of the Orthodox revolutionary fantasies and delusions, the Orthodox's willingness to accept or adapt to alien political movements, were the better equipped to survive in an age of Stalinist expansion and of the widespread credibility of Stalinism even in the political eye of its critics and its bourgeois outright enemies. New section: Dogmatic Marxism and Apparatus Politics. A week after Trotsky's death on the 21st of August 1940, a big memorial meeting for Trotsky was held in New York. Al Glotzer represented the Workers' Party there, but the main speaker was James P. Cannon. His speech was printed in the Militant, 6th of September 1940, featured in this volume, Cannon's powerful and moving speech for Trotsky was also a clear declaration of what Marxism was to be for the Orthodox now that Trotsky, its eminent practitioner, was dead. It was the manifesto of a new Trotskyism. Quote, "The mighty ideas of Trotsky are ... a clear guide to action in all the complexities of our epoch and a constant reassurance that we are right ... He worked against time to pour out through his pen the whole rich content of his mighty brain and preserve it in permanent written form for us ... End quote. Cannon. Marxism was now the text of Trotsky and earlier leaders, but primarily of Trotsky, who had unpacked his mind of all it contained and, quote, laid up a literary treasure for us, a treasure that the moths and the rust cannot eat, end quote. Not said but implied, and it would be the guiding rule for the Orthodox, was the idea that Marxism as a process of scientific investigation had more or less come to an end. Now those whom Cannon himself called Trotsky's, quote, disciples had to, quote, apply Trotsky's, quote, teachings, as they sometimes put it, they themselves would, of course, have to pick and choose at each time whatever of Trotsky's written, quote, treasure, end quote, they thought relevant. Marxism was now a set of texts and old analyses, positions and predictions for deployment by, quote, Trotsky's disciples, end quote. They would defend it and construe it in current politics. Before the 1940 memorial meeting, an attempt had been made to bring Trotsky's corpse to New York for the ceremony, as well as being an undeserved insult to the Mexican people, whose government had given the live Trotsky refuge. This was bizarre. The idea of a Marxist political event organized around the specially imported carcass or ashes of the great dead man. The American government's refusal to give permission saved the Orthodox from this mummery, and they had the memorial without the corpse. More than 40 years later in London, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the organization, now defunct, that had once been the Cannonite section in Britain, but had long ago separated from them, somehow got hold of Trotsky's death mask, and used it rather as Cannon had wanted to use Trotsky's body. They organized a mass meeting in which the centerpiece was the death mask. It was a mix of showmanship, idolatry, kitsch religion, and all-round mumbo-jumbo. The Workers' Revolutionary Party had come close to realizing Cannon's ambition half a century later. Cannon, however, did so with Trotsky's thinking what he couldn't do with Trotsky's corpse. Cannon took on the role of St. Peter, to whom Jesus Christ had supposedly said, quote, "Thou art Peter," end quote. His name up to then had been Simon. Peter meant, quote, rock, end quote. And, quote, "Upon this rock I will build my church," end quote. Wikipedia says St. Peter lived from 64 to 68 AD, also known as Peter the Apostle, Simon Peter, Simeon, Simon, or Cephas, was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ and one of the first leaders of the early Christian church. St. Peter appears repeatedly and prominently in all 4 New Testament Gospels as well as the Acts of Apostles. Catholic tradition accredits Peter as the first bishop of Rome or pope and also as the first bishop of Antioch. According to Christian tradition, Peter was crucified in Rome under Emperor Nero. The ancient Christian churches all venerate Peter as a major saint and as the founder of the Church of Antioch and the Church of Rome, but they differ in their attitudes regarding the authority of St. Peter's successors. According to Catholic teachings, Jesus promised Peter a special position in the church. In the New Testament, the name, quote, Simon Peter, end quote, is found 19 times. Peter is the brother of St. Andrew, and they both were fishermen. The Gospel of Mark, in particular, was traditionally thought to show the influence of Peter's preaching and eyewitness memories. He is also mentioned under either the name of Peter or Cephas in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and the epistle to the Galatians. The New Testament also includes 2 general epistles, 1 Peter and 2 Peter, that are traditionally attributed to him. Both modern scholarship generally rejects the Petrine authorship of both. Nevertheless, evangelicals and Catholics have always affirmed Peter's authorship, and recently evangelical scholars have revived the claim of Petrine authorship of these epistles. Based on contemporary historical data, Peter's papacy is estimated to have spanned from 30 AD to Peter's death, which would make Peter the longest reigning pope, at anywhere from 34 to 38 years. However, this has never been verified. Saint Irenaeus, circa 130 to circa 130 to circa 202 AD, in parentheses, explains the Apostle Peter, his see, and his successors in Book 3 of Adversus Heresis, parentheses, against heresies, and parentheses. In the book, Irenaeus wrote that Peter and Paul founded and organized the church in Rome. Sources suggest that at first the terms episcopus and presbyteros were used interchangeably, with the census among scholars being that by the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries, local congregations were led by bishops and presbyters, whose duties of office overlapped or were indistinguishable from one another. Protestant and secular historians generally agree that there was probably, quote, no single, quote, monarchical, end quote, bishop in Rome before the middle of the 2nd century, and likely later, end quote. Outside of the New Testament, several apocryphal books were later attributed to him, in particular the Acts of Peter, Gospel of Peter, Preaching of Peter, Apocalypse of Peter, and Judgment of Peter, although scholars believe these works to be pseudepigrapha. So that's who Peter is. He keeps using these references. I don't know if I'll be able to look them all up, but we'll see. Canon took on the role of St. Peter, to whom Jesus had supposedly said, quote, thou art Peter, end quote. Peter's name up to that time had been Simon. Peter meant, quote, rock, end quote. Quote, and upon this rock I will build my church, end quote. Peter was, so the Catholic Church said, the first pope, the, quote, vicar on earth, end quote, of the departed Christ. For the Trotskyist movement, Canon also took a role similar to that played for the, quote, the, quote, DeLeonites, end quote, the Socialist Labor Party by Arnold Peterson after the death in 1914 of the Socialist Labor Party's central figure, Daniel DeLeon. DeLeon's dogmatizing and sterile, quote, vicar on earth, end quote. Where am I? The Socialist Labor Party is a political party in the United States. It was established in 1876 and was the first socialist party formed in the country. Originally known as the Workingmen's Party of the United States, the party changed its name in 1877 to Socialistic Labor Party and again sometime in the late 1880s to Socialist Labor Party. The party was additionally known in some states as the Industrial Party or Industrial Government Party. In 1890, the Socialist Labor Party came under the influence of Daniel de Leon, who used his role as editor of the Weekly People, the Socialist Labor Party's English-language official organ, to expand the party's popularity beyond its then largely German-speaking membership. Despite his accomplishments, Daniel de Leon was a polarizing figure among the Socialist Labor Party's membership. In 1899, Daniel de Leon's opponents left the Socialist Labor Party and merged with the Social Democratic Party of America to form the Socialist Party of America. After his death in 1914, de Leon was followed as National Secretary by Arnold Peterson, who I'm going to look up in a second. Critical of both the Soviet Union and reformist wing of the Socialist Party of America, the Socialist Labor Party became increasingly isolated from the majority of the American left. Its support increased in the 1950s and in the early 1960s when Eric Haas was influential in the party, but slightly declined in the mid-1960s. The Socialist Labor Party experienced another increase in support in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but then subsequently declined at a fast rate, with the party last nominating a candidate for president in 1976. In 2008, the party closed its national office and the party's newspaper, The People, ceased publication in 2011. The party advocates, quote, socialist industrial unionism, end quote, the belief in a fundamental transformation of society through the combined political and industrial action of the working class, organized in industrial unions. Wikipedia says Arnold Peterson lived from 1885 to 1976 and was the National Secretary of the Socialist Labor Party of America from 1914 to 1969. Arnold Peterson played a major role as spokesman for that party and as a promoter of the de Leonist version of Marxist theory in the 20th century. Okay, back to the text. Peter was, so the Catholic Church said, the first pope, the quote, vicar on earth, end quote, for the departed Christ. For the Trotskyist movement, Cannon also took a role similar to that played for the, quote, de Leonites, end quote, parenthesis, the Socialist Labor Party, end parenthesis, by Arnold Peterson after the death in 1914 of the Socialist Labor Party's central figure, Daniel de Leon. De Leon's dogmatizing and sterile, quote, vicar on earth, end quote. I wonder who would be the Shachtman compared to this Arnold Peterson. That this was Cannon's conception of Marxism would be demonstrated again and again all through the 1940s, the formative period of Orthodox Trotskyism. Much of their history in that period was a succession of more or less demented blunders rooted in a fixation on Trotsky's, quote, predictions, end quote, and on verbal formulae taken from Trotsky. We have seen that Trotsky had said that bourgeois democracy would soon give way in all the combatant states to fascism or authoritarianism. That proved to be not true of the USA, Britain, etc. during the war. It was proved not true in Italy after the fall of Mussolini in 1943, and in France as the Nazis retreated in 1944. But the Orthodox, or most of them, the British Revolutionary Communist Party, was comparatively sensible about it. Insisted again long after the actual establishment of new bourgeois democratic states in Western Europe, that only authoritarian or, quote, Bonapartist, end quote, police states could emerge there. The Orthodox understood Trotsky to have believed that all imperialisms were equally predatory, the British and American as predatory as Hitler's.
Therefore, they concluded the triumphed USA would treat the European peoples like peoples liberated from German rule, just as the Nazis had. That conclusion was by 1943 to 44 far from sensible. Yet long after the war was over and the Americans were not behaving like the Nazis in Europe, the Orthodox clung to their belief. Trotsky had predicted that during and immediately after the war, there would be mass working-class anti-capitalist risings and socialist victories. That had been a plausible idea before the war, rooted in the experience at the end of World War I, but it did not happen. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945, and in Japan on the 2nd of September 1945. But had the war really ended? Had the war really ended? At a public meeting on the 4th of November 1945, Cannon addressed himself to that question. No, the war hadn't ended, Cannon said. Only, quote, careless thinkers, end quote, believed it had. The Marxist, Trotsky's disciples, knew better. There was only a pause in the ongoing and unending war. Trotsky's predictions would yet be proven true. Trotsky's Marxist foresight would be vindicated. Everyone, well-prepared and experienced speakers at public meetings, too, sometimes get carried away with an idea or makes exaggerations. There was a sane and reasonable idea within the ridiculous claim that World War II was not over. Many smaller wars continued. Lines were already being drawn for a possible World War III, but sensible people would see the exaggeration or have it pointed out to them and modify or retract. Not Cannon. Not the, quote, disciples, end quote. When Felix Maurer proposed to have the Socialist Workers' Party repudiate the idea that World War II was not over, the rest of the Socialist Workers' Party political committee rallied to Cannon. Felix Maurer's motion was, quote, factionally motivated, end quote, and therefore it was not necessary to separate the Socialist Workers' Party from the idea expressed by the leader of the Orthodox in a major public speech printed in their paper that World War II was still going on. Thereafter, the broad idea that the war was not over was repeated again and again in the militant, in a toned-down and not crazy form. For example, quote, only militant warned, quote, there is no peace, end quote, end quote. Parentheses, 16th of March, 1946. To reassert the idea in some form while silently retreating from others from the letter of what Cannon had said became a point of honor with the Orthodox. The accumulating effect of this prestige-heavy and politics-light approach to Marxism was to change the public persona of the organization from one of reasonable Marxists in touch with reality, parenthesis, and where necessary with their own fallibility, end parenthesis, into one that was quirky, arbitrary, capricious, a little eccentric, sometimes very eccentric. Reading the Orthodox papers and magazines of the 1940s, you get the feel of people not reasoning things through, but tacking, trimming, and maneuvering with, quote, smart, end quote, formulations and gambits cut loose from their notional political doctrine and Marxist framework. You get the feel of agitation-led, quote, lines, end quote, commentaries and not honest or free discussion of unexpected or problem-raising events, of an edifice dominated by apparatus politics and calculations about likely short-term political effect, above all of arbitrariness and caprice. There was a famous dispute recorded in Lenin's What Is to Be Done between Lenin and the future Menshevik and future Stalinist Alexander Martynov about the relationship for Marxists between agitation and propaganda. According to Wikipedia, Alexander Martynov lived from 1865 to 1935. Alexander Martynov was a leading Menshevik politician before the Russian Revolution of 1917, and for a few years after the revolution, a critic of Leon Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. End footnote. Back to the text, not end footnote. Back to the text. There's a famous dispute recorded in Lenin's What Is to Be Done when Lenin and the future Menshevik, parenthesis, and future Stalinist, end parenthesis, Alexander Martynov about the relationship for Marxists between agitation and propaganda. Martynov thought agitation and propaganda were separate things that, so to speak, sometimes didn't talk to each other. Agitation was measured by agitation's results as a, quote, call to action, end quote. Lenin, following Plekhanov, argued that the agitation was bound by theory and basic propaganda of the movement. There could be no such thing as doctrine-free agitation, no separate category of slogans which were, quote, calls to action, end quote. Agitation on specific questions flowed from the basic doctrine and purposes of the Marxist movement and led back to them. In Canon and the Orthodox after Trotsky's death, for example, in their jugglings about Russia, there is a loosening or breaking of the link between agitation, parenthesis, which Plekhanov defined as one or a few ideas reaching a large audience, end parenthesis, and propaganda, parenthesis, many ideas reaching a few, end parenthesis, in theory. On the one hand, the Orthodox sometimes practiced daft fidelity to the letter of Trotsky. On the other, when it suited them, they could ignore Trotsky's reasoning. Not only Trotsky, but also Canon had based their assessment of the Stalinist USSR in 1939-40 on the idea that it was unviable even in the short term, and certainly incapable of large expansion. Russia had survived and seized half of Europe. The Workers' Party asked the Orthodox, what about it? What about that? On this, the Orthodox were not at all, quote, Trotsky to the letter, end quote, people. They made a joke of it. Shachtman thinks that he has a, quote, promissory note, end quote, from Trotsky and from history, exclamation point. Ha ha ha. These were pick-and-choose dogmatists. One reason for their fixation on, for example, the idea that bourgeois democracy was impossible in post-war Europe was their own inability to elaborate revolutionary working-class politics based on the same premises, norms, and methods as Trotsky and unexpected realities. The truth about all dogmatists is that in practice, the dogmatists pick and choose what to do empirically, according to pressures, perceived opportunities or dangers, pet ideas, brainstorms, and then fit dogma to deed, even when the text fetishists get hooked in the wheels of a dogma which runs away with them. The idea about bourgeois democratic regimes being impossible in post-war Europe, for example, on the whole they match dogma to deed, not deed to dogma. Marxism becomes not method and precept, but afterthought and rationalization, apparatus Marxism. In Orthodox Trotskyism, the tendency over decades came to be, quote, for, quote, the party, end quote, and what was considered to be good for, quote, the party, end quote, to become the all-defining supreme good, to become what the USSR was to the Stalinized Comintern. There are very few things people calling themselves Trotskyists have not done for organizational advantages. Much of the time, for many of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyist groups, everything, perceptions of reality, quote, perspectives, end quote, truth consistency, principle is up for, quote, construing, end quote, and reinterpretation in the light of perceived party interest. Their, quote, Marxism, end quote, is, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote. It exists to rationalize what the party apparatus thinks it best to do. The idea of the, quote, finished, end quote, or, quote, unchanging, end quote, program has sometimes been presented as a barrier to opportunism, but in fact has become a license for it. Any emphasis, extrapolation, or selective reading is justified so long as it remains or can be claimed as remaining within the limits of the bare-bones formula. This, quote, Marxism, end quote, with its eyes put out, chained to the mill wheel, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote. Apparatus Marxism is a peculiarly rancid species of, quote, Marxism, end quote, from which everything, quote, objective, end quote, disinterested, spontaneous, and creative is banished. Creativity is incompatible with the prime function of, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote, rationalizing, quote, for the party, end quote, and its apparatus. Creativity, and so to speak, spontaneity, is the prerogative of the all-shaping suck-it-and-see empirical citizens who staff the, quote, party, end quote, apparatus. Everything is thereby turned on its head. The history of the Orthodox Trotskyist or Canaanite organizations is a story shaped by this conception of the relationship of Marxism to, quote, the revolutionary party, end quote, as a handmaiden of the apparatus. Quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote, is both blind and sterile because apparatus Marxism is not and cannot be a guide to honest analysis and a practice consistent with theory. It exists to rationalize a practice that is in fact guided by something else, usually the perceived advantage of the organization. For Marxists, the unity of theory and practice means that practice is guided by theory, a theory constantly replenished and sometimes modified by experience. In, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote, the proper relationship of theory to practice and of practice to theory is inverted. Our predominant Marxist culture today is largely made up of the various, quote, apparatus Marxisms, end quote, protected as behind high tariff walls by the, quote, party, end quote, regimes they serve. Demurrers or questioners of cloistered certainties are inimical to that culture, which progressively over the 1940s reshaped the Orthodox Trotskyists and their politics and their policies. James P. Cannon was the Zenovievist cuckoo in Trotsky's small nest. It was not all negative Zinovievism. Cannon stood for a serious attitude to organization, and that was necessary. But the Zinovievism eventually, as Cannon himself seemed ruefully to have recognized in the 1960s, quote, strangled the party, end quote. Grown fully and without Trotsky restraining him, Cannon bit off the heads of a lot of the smaller birds in the nest or pushed them out. With Trotsky's help in 1939-40, Cannon tried to bite off the head of some of the bigger birds, in the first place Shachtman. He, quote, bumped off, end quote, a succession of leading Socialist Workers' Party intellectuals in 1939-40, parentheses, Shachtman and others, end parentheses, 1943-46, parentheses, Morrow, Goldman, and Van Huysenoort, end parentheses, and 1952-4, parentheses, Cochrane, Braverman, end parentheses, until Cannon had left only the Cannon cultists, George Novak and Joseph Hansen, and until his death in 1956, John G. Wright, who was certainly a patronized member of Cannon's inner circle. Cannon again and again argued that the organization become, quote, tighter, more, quote, centralized. Farrell Dobbs, who succeeded Cannon as secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party and served in the post until the 1940s, summarized in 1941 how those close to Cannon had seen the April 1940 split. Quote, the petty bourgeois minority, tried to force the party to renounce the defense of the Soviet Union. They tried to turn the organization into the shambles of a social democratic debating society, end quote. Parenthesis, The Militant, 13th of September 1941. Eventually, the, quote, tightening, end quote, and the, quote, centralization, end quote, squeezed the life out of the organization. The question of Cannon's ascribed preeminence in the organization had been a contentious issue since about 1929. The notion, and it was Cannon's governing notion, of a fixed, quote, prestige, end quote, for certain leaders and a common leadership duty to maintain it could not but play a deadly role. Inevitably, a leader's prestige fluctuates. Everyone, even a Trotsky, sometimes makes mistakes, is slow to understand or too hasty or one-sided in response. To try to stop the natural fluctuation of prestige involves putting the judgment and the freedom to think and express themselves of the organization's members in a bureaucratic straitjacket. It comes to involve falsification of the political records, covering up and stifling of anyone who might politically undermine the leader's prestige. A serious revolutionary socialist will practice a politics of truth and honest dealing, and inescapably that involves being unpopular sometimes. That, as they say, goes with the territory. Valid prestige based on honest dealing in politics can come only from having been right on a number of occasions, despite unpopularity. That is, the, quote, prestige, end quote, which Lenin had in the Bolshevik Party, for example, is very different from prestige based on pretend omniscience and an eternal bureaucratic struggle to maintain that omniscience. That prestige based on pretend omniscience. Cannon, in his Notes on the Party Discussion produced during his battle with Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow, parenthesis, Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin, Volume 7, Number 2, April 1945, end parenthesis, was surely right that, quote, workers does not stay in a kibitzers club. The fuck is a kibitzers club? According to Wikipedia, Kibitzer is a Yiddish term for a spectator, usually one who offers, parenthesis, often unwanted, and parenthesis, advice or commentary. The term can be applied to any activity, but is most commonly used to describe spectators in games such as contract bridge, chess, go, and Schafkopf. In card games, a kibitzer simply refers to a spectator watching a player's hand. Kibitzers are expected to remain silent and not impact the game. Kibitz and kibitzer are derived from German kibitzen, to look over a card player's shoulder, perhaps derived from kibitz, a lapwing or peewit. Back to the text. Cannon, in his notes on the party discussion produced during his battle with Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow, was surely right that, quote, workers will not stay in a kibitzers club. They won't talk back to the articulate smart alecks, and they won't write letters to the national office either. They, quote, vote with their feet, end quote, end quote. And certainly from that must flow some regulations as to time, occasion, and place for discussion, and broad guidelines for the chairing of such discussions and branches. But the gap between, quote, kibitzers, end quote, and workers who can gain confidence in abstract debate and attend meetings only by effort against the pressures of social conditions and of long and tiring hours of work, demand not just restraint on the, quote, kibitzers, but a, quote, leveling up, end quote, of the workers by education, experience, and discussion. As Gramsci put it, quote, education, culture, the spreading of knowledge and experience, this is the independence of the masses from the intellectuals, end quote. Or again, quote, Marxism is antithetical to this Catholic position, bracket, of an iron discipline over the intellectuals so that they do not pass beyond certain limits of differentiation, end bracket. If, bracket, Marxism, end bracket, asserts the need for contact between the intellectuals and the simple people, it does so not in order to limit scientific activity and maintain unity at the low level of the masses, but precisely in order to build an intellectual moral block which makes politically possible the intellectual progress of the masses, and not only a few groups of intellectuals, bracket, this, end bracket, means working to produce cadres of intellectuals of a new type who arise directly from the masses, though remaining in contact with them and becoming the stay of the corset, end quote. In fact, Cannon offered as a solution a leveling down. What did the, quote, kibitzers, end quote, of the 1945 Socialist Workers' Party want to discuss? General politics, issues in dispute inside and outside the Socialist Workers' Party, current events, Marxism, That such things be discussed by the membership is a necessity for a healthy party organization. To stifle the, quote, articulate, end quote, people who want to discuss those things in deference to new working class, parenthesis, and other, end parenthesis, members, or with Canada in 1945, in deference to a hoped-for big, quote, influx of new politically inexperienced worker militants, end quote, which in fact never came, is to stultify the organization, cramp the functioning of its cadres, and cut off the development of new worker activists. It is to make discussion of complex political issues into a preserve of an intellectually privileged caste within the organization, or just a few leaders, parenthesis, or one leader, end parenthesis, and their personal political friends, sheltered from criticism, and a consequence of that is progressively to lower the intellectual and political level of the, quote, top, end quote, layer in the organization itself. That deadly, quote, dumbing down, end quote, could already be seen in the Socialist Workers' Party USA in the early 1940s. It did not eliminate petty bourgeois intellectuals, and in any case, they should not be eliminated. It just added another requirement for entry into complex discussions, selection or by or subservience to the leading group, the apparatus, or, quote, the leader, end quote. It led to a lowering of the level of the, quote, intellectuals, end quote. A Wright for a Shachtman, a Novak for a Morrow, a Hansen for a Goldman, or a Dobbs for a McKinney, was not progress. If entirely party-trained intellectuals, without a, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, parenthesis, that is, a wide, end parenthesis, educational background are made the ideal, then they are likely to be narrow and one-sided. Cannon's approach tended artificially to cut the party off from contributions not only from independent-minded, but also from better-trained intellectuals. In an apparatus-ruled party, no one can know or say more than the apparatus and its leader says or licenses them to say. John G. Wright, who conjured up the, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, nonsense, was not a negligible man. John G. Wright translated important texts and wrote some valuable articles. John G. Wright, like Cannon, was one of the last of the Orthodox to accept the formula that the new Stalinist states were, quote, deformed worker states, end quote. Even so, in the early 1940s, John G. Wright had the position John G. Wright had in the Socialist Workers' Party press by virtue of membership in a clique around Cannon. Novak and Hansen were selected over time and survived by dint of their intellectual and political biddability and willingness to operate within limits set by the apparatus, that is, to one degree or another, by their intellectual and political lack of independence and of personal political integrity. In a word, by their corruptibility. The leveling down and stultifying gradually killed intellectual life in the Socialist Workers' Party and paved the way for the coup in 1979, when appropriate apparatus made and now apparatus controlling younger leaders revolutionized the organization from above. For more information on that, check out the pieces by Robert J. Alexander that are on this channel on the later period of the American Socialist Workers' Party. The apparatus made and now apparatus controlling young leaders made the Socialist Workers' Party a Castroite sect and expelled the remaining veteran Trotskyists, parenthesis, except notably George Novak, who remained subservient even to the Castroite, quote, leadership, end quote, and apparatus, end parenthesis. The smaller would-be Trotskyist groups around the Socialist Workers' Party reported in the mid-80s an episode that in its symbolism summed up the whole tragic story. The new Socialist Workers' Party leaders threw out Cannon's personal collection of pamphlets and documents, placing them in a dumpster. When they found interested people with respect for Cannon rescuing the documents, they put a guard on the dumpster until it was hauled away. The paths of artificial prestige sooner or later led only to the historical dumpster. Their junking of the, quote, old canonism, end quote, could happen the way it did, through clique control of the apparatus, only on the basis of further development of the apparatus control Cannon created after the 1940 split. One of the veterans expelled after the 1979 coup, Frank Lovell, described the regime after 1953 like this, quote, disagreements that developed within the National Committee were smoothed over and remained unresolved. The leaders in the national office made decisions by consensus and discouraged any general discussion within the ranks of the party about the correctness of their decisions or the best way of implementing them. This sufficed to keep the organization together, ... But this method tended to have a stultifying effect. It discouraged political initiative and debate, end quote. Parenthesis, Introduction to In Defense of American Trotskyism, FIT pamphlet 1992, end parenthesis. New section, Cannon and Shachtman. Oh, wait, let me make sure I'm recording here again. The honest critic of the Trotskyist movement, of both the Cannon and Shachtman segments of it, which are intertwined in their history and in their politics, must remind himself and the reader that those criticized must be seen in the framework of the movement as a whole. Even those who were not mistaken most of the time were more than the sum of their mistakes, and some of them a great deal more. The U.S. Trotskyists, Shachtmanites, and Cannonites alike mobilized 50,000 people in New York in 1939 to stop fascists marching into Jewish neighborhoods of that city. When some of the extent of the Holocaust became public, the Orthodox responded vigorously, and the Heterodox would have concurred, quote, anger against Hitler and sympathy for the Jewish people are not enough. Every worker must do what he can to aid and protect the Jews from those who hunt them down. The Allied ruling classes, while making capital of Hitler's treatment of the Jews for their war propaganda, discuss and deliberate on this question endlessly. The workers in the Allied countries must raise the demand, give immediate refuge to the Jews, ... quotas, immigration laws, visa. These must be cast aside. Open the doors of refuge to those who otherwise face extermination, end quote. Parenthesis, Statement of the Fourth International, the Militant, 3rd of April, 1943, end parenthesis. We, the Orthodox, the writer was one of them, identified with the exploited and oppressed and sided with them and with the labor movement of which we ourselves were part. With people struggling for national independence, with black victims of zoological racism. Wait, is this a... I think this might be a quote, but there's no quotation mark at the beginning of it. I don't know, but I'll just read it as is. We, the Orthodox, the writer was one of them, identified with the exploited and oppressed and sided with them and with the labor movements of which we ourselves were part, with people struggling for national independence, with the black victims of zoological racism. We took sides always with the exploited and oppressed. To those we reached, we brought the basic Marxist account of class society and history and of the capitalist society in which we live. We criticized, condemned, and organized against Stalinism. Even at the least adequate, the Orthodox Trotskyists generally put forward proposals that in some meant a radical transformation of Stalinist society, a revolution against Stalinism. Always and everywhere, the Orthodox Trotskyists fought chauvinism. When some got lost politically, as they sometimes did and do, it was usually because of too blandly negative zeal for things that, quote, in themselves, end quote, were good, such as anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. We mobilized political and practical support for movements of colonial rule. French Trotskyists living in a world gone crazy with chauvinism of every kind set out to win over and organized German soldiers occupying France. They produced a newspaper aimed at German worker soldiers. Some 20 French Trotskyist and German soldier sympathizers lost their lives when the Nazis suppressed it. The Orthodox Trotskyists even kept some elements of feminism alive in a world in which it was long eclipsed. Michel Pablo, in French jail for helping the Algerians in their war of independence, applied himself to studying and writing about the, quote, woman question, end quote. Large numbers of people shared the view of the Trotskyists on specific questions and worked with them or in parallel with them. The Trotskyists alone presented and argued for a whole world outlook that challenged the outlook of the capitalist and Stalinist ruling classes. We embody the great truths of Marxism in a world where they had been bricked up alive by Stalinism. We kept fundamental texts of anti-Stalinist Marxism in circulation. Read the accounts of the day-to-day mistreatment of black people in the USA in the mid-20th century, Jim Crow in the South, where blacks had been slaves, segregation in the North, all-pervasive humiliations, exclusions, beatings, mob lynchings, burnings, the systematic ill-treatment of children as of grown-up black people. Work through even a little of that terrible story, and you run the risk of despairing of the human race. The Trotskyists consistently and unswervingly challenging Jim Crow, championing and defending the victims of injustice, showed what they were. To have been less would have been despicable. That does not subtract from the merits of those who did what was right and necessary when most people did not. James Buchanan and Max Shachtman, the main representatives of the two currents of Trotskyism, were in my judgment heroes, both of them. Cannon, when almost all of his generation of communist international leaders had gone down to Stalinism or over to the bourgeoisie, remained with what Cannon was in his youth, a fighter for working class emancipation. I make no excuses for the traits and deeds of Cannon, which are shown in a bad light in this volume. It is necessary to make and keep an honest history of our movement if we are to learn from it. After Trotsky's death, Cannon found himself and fought to remain the central leader of the Trotskyist movement. a job which, as the Heterodox said, he was badly equipped politically to do. Moving by instinct in the great tradition of which he was part, he steered a course between what he saw as the twin evils, Stalinophilia and Stalinophobia, as he might have said, between Deutscher and Shachtman. But that was a long way from being politically or intellectually adequate. Cannon did the best he could in a world that had turned murderously hostile to the politics Cannon worked for and for the goals Cannon fought to achieve. More than once, Cannon must have reminded himself of the old lines, quote, "The times are out of joint. O cursed spite, that I ever was born to set it right." End quote. James P. Cannon remained faithful to the working class and to revolutionary socialism. Such a book as Cannon's History of American Trotskyism cannot be taken as full or authoritative history, but it has value as what Gramsci called a, quote, living book, end quote. Quote, not a systematic treatment, but a, quote, living, end quote, book in which political ideology and political science are fused in the dramatic form of a, quote, myth, end quote, end quote. Socialists today can learn much from both Shachtman and Cannon. In his last decade, he died in 1972, Shachtman followed the U.S. trade unions into conventional politics and dirty Democratic Party politicking. Shachtman took up a relationship to U.S. capitalism paralleling that of the Cannonites to Stalinism of different sorts and at different times. Politically, that was suicidal, but those who again and again took similar attitudes to one Stalinism or another forfeit the right to sneer and denounce. Shachtman got lost politically at the end of the 1950s. The Cannonites got lost politically in relation to Stalinism 20 years earlier! Exclamation point. When Trotsky in 1939-40, living under tremendous personal strain, reached a crossroads in his political life and fumbled and stumbled politically, Shachtman, who had tremendous and lasting regard for Trotsky and a strong loyalty to what Trotsky stood for, had the integrity to spirit to fight Trotsky and those who, Cannon and his comrades in the first place, were starting on a course that would warp and distort and in serious part destroy their politics in the decade ahead and long after. The Prometheus myth has been popular among socialists, supplying names for organizations and newspapers. As punishment for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to the humankind, the Titan Prometheus is chained forever to a rock in the Caucasian mountains, and vultures eternally rip at his liver. Shachtman picked up the proletarian fire Trotsky had for a moment fumbled with and carried it forward. Generations of mockery, obloquy, what the fuck? How do you say the name? Obloquy?
Obloquy.
Obloquy, meaning insult, abuse, affront, offense, outrage. Obloquy. Generations of mockery, obloquy, misrepresentation, and odium, where it was not deserved, have been his punishment for having been right against Trotsky and Cannon. This book is intended as a contribution to the work of those who strive to refurbish and renew the movement that in their own way both James P. Cannon and Max Shachtman tried to serve and served. Historiography. New section. Most histories of the Trotskyist movement are what might be called, quote, apparatus historiography, end quote. They are tendentious, selective to the point of distortion or outright falsification. The histories are written for purposes other than providing accurate chronicles or analyses. It sometimes reaches the point that there is very little real history in the stories of themselves and their opponents that some Trotskyist organizations tell. That was true of the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Jerry Healy, now long defunct but once the biggest activist organization of the revolutionary left in Britain. But not only extremely degenerated organizations fail to provide accurate history, even honest academic-style efforts such as those of Robert Alexander fail miserably. This volume tries to provide a broader political picture by presenting in their own words the different sides of every dispute it covers. Of course, even when selection can serve to distort, all I can offer the reader is assurance that I have not knowingly held back anything that would change the picture my selection paints. The reclamation of a true picture of our history is the reclamation of a true picture of our own history is one of the most important tasks of revolutionary Marxists today, an essential element in reconstituting a viable revolutionary socialism. As with Lenin's work on state and revolution, the reanimation of revolutionary Marxism requires that we dig down into our own roots. The, quote, Shachtmanites, end quote, have, in my opinion, suffered worse in the handed-down history of the revolutionary movement after the death of Trotsky, and yet in the 1940s and 50s they continued and elaborate an alternative strain of Trotskyism from that of the canon tendency, whose literature has, for most people today and for more than 3/4 of a century, has defined, quote, Trotskyism, end quote. The historical reputation of the Shachtmanites has largely been defined by the Canaanites' account of them. Peter Drucker's biography, Max Shachtman is Left, which I'm planning on reading this week, published in 1994, and the first volume of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, published in 1998 on this channel, have opened things up quite a bit in the last 2 decades, but for many people still, the very tendentious selection of polemical texts by Trotsky put together by Cannon and Cannon's comrades in 1942 under the title In Defense of Marxism has frozen the image of the Shachtmanites. Generations of Trotskyists have been cut off from the ideas of, quote, the other Trotskyists, end quote, and thereby from many ideas of Trotsky himself, major aspects of whose thinking were jettisoned by the Canaanite, quote, Orthodox Trotskyists, end quote. The history of that time is told usually by supporters of the Orthodox. It is told when it deals with the Shachtmanites as if the Heterodox were aberrant and the Orthodox were balanced, properly pro-USSR, but adequately anti-Stalinist. Pretty much the opposite is true. The Orthodox went prolifically haywire after June 1941. In important respects, they ceased to be Trotskyists at all, as that term had been understood before June 1941. A valuable and honest book like Peter Drucker's account of Max Shachtman is diminished by the author's apparent belief that there was, side by side with the Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League, a balanced or more balanced Trotskyism. Peter Drucker is a member of the Mandalite Fourth International. There surely was not. Check out the review by Ernest Haberkern, who also edited important works on the Third Camp Trotskyist, particularly neither capitalism nor socialism, neither capitalism nor socialism, about theories of bureaucratic collectivism. Has a very good article. A review article of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman book, which is a very, I haven't read the book, so I don't really know the details of what is being critiqued, but it seems like a very interesting, has a lot of very interesting observations. It is not possible to understand the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League without a properly filled-in background of the politics and activities of the Orthodox. One can't be understood without consideration of the other. For the Workers' Party in the 1940s as well as into the 1950s, it is a case of what can they know of Shachtman, who only Shachtman For the Workers' Party in the 1940s as well and well into the 50s, it is a case of what can they know of Shachtman, who only Shachtman know. I don't know, that's a typo or something. If not possible to clear space for the real history of the two Trotskyisms without demolishing the myths and self-serving misrepresentations of the Orthodox, which occupy the space now. The story of the Orthodox Trotskyist told in this introduction and in the documents in this book is one of political confusion, bewilderment, inadequacy, and defeat, of a small political tendency being overwhelmed by events and, despite its revolutionary and working-class anti-Stalinist best intentions, magnetized by the Stalinist USSR as it conquered and consolidated a great European empire, of a small political tribe that got lost trying half blind to work its way through the murderous maze of mid-20th century history. From the standpoint of broad, long-term, impartial history, there is no mystery here and there should not be much surprise. The Fourth International was a very small political tendency. It was heavily dependent on one person, Trotsky, who was, you could say, a visitor from another world, the lost world of Russian and international Bolshevism. Trotsky was removed by the assassin at the decisive turning point of mid-20th century history. So soon were many of his most experienced comrades victims of Stalin and fascism. The fact of the Polish Trotskyists in the war is only an extreme example of the fate of the whole tendency. They were targeted by the German and Russian totalitarians who turned Poland into a battlefield and then a slaughterhouse. They were hunted by Nazis and Stalinists as communists and Trotskyists as Poles, and parenthesis, a very large portion of them, and parenthesis, as Jews. Not a single member of the Trotskyist organization in Poland survived the war. At the end of the war, the Stalinists in Greece slaughtered several hundred Trotskyists. The Nazis had already killed the Greek Trotskyist outstanding leader, Pentelis Poliopoulos. In Vietnam, the members of the sizable Trotskyist organization were massacred in 1945-46 by the Vietnamese Stalinists led by Ho Chi Minh. In China, the members of the Trotskyist organizations were killed by the Kuomintang or the Stalinists or put into Maoist jails for decades. 1 second. Gotta take note of this. Sorry about that. Now I'm going to irritate you further by looking up this Pentelis Poliopoulos. Wikipedia says Pentelis Poliopoulos lived from 1900 to 1943 and was a Greek communist, anti-fascist, and one-time general secretary of the Communist Party of Greece (KKE). Pentelis Poliopoulos stood for the internationalist and revolutionary character of the communist movement. Pentelis Poliopoulos is among the founders of the Trotskyist movement in Greece. Back to the text. Even before that, the leaders of the Fourth International in Europe were killed as the International was being proclaimed in 1938. Rudolf Clement, a German emigre, was kidnapped and murdered on the eve of the Fourth International Congress. His body, without its head, was found floating in the Seine. Leon Sedov, son of Natalia Sedova and Leon Trotsky, and an important leader of the Fourth International in his own right, was murdered in a French hospital in February 1938. Wikipedia says Rudolf Clement was a German member of the Trotskyist left opposition in Fourth International. He lived from 1908 to 1938. Fluent in 5 languages, Rudolf Clement joined Trotsky as his secretary in Principe, Turkey. In 1933, where Rudolf Clement learned a 6th language, Russian. Rudolf Clement accompanied Trotsky to France, where Rudolf Clement remained after Trotsky was expelled and ultimately found home in Mexico. Rudolf Clement came to lead Trotsky's international secretariat from France. Rudolf Clement was assassinated by the Stalinist NKVD in 1938 while preparing a political report that included an investigation of NKVD agent Mark Zborowski, who had infiltrated the Trotskyist movement in France. Back to the text. This slaughter was inflicted on a political tendency which faced the theoretical and political conundrums that exercised Trotsky at the end of his life. Many quit in despair, exhaustion, and disgust, or a combination of them. Like the Fourth International, whose center was moved from Europe to the USA after the Paris Commune, the Fourth had its center relocated to New York early in World War II. In Europe, underground Trotskyist organizations continued to exist and fight. All their expectations were proved false. Their expectations of Stalinism, too. Stalinism survived and prospered and kept its grip on the working class movement that shaped everything else. In other words, this is the history of a movement which suffered a comprehensive defeat. One of the modes of its defeat was that it was, to a serious extent, conquered and politically overwhelmed by Stalinism. In the name of, quote, defending the USSR, unquote, it turned itself into a group of auxiliary frontier guards, albeit highly critical ones. It went into a political and historical blind alley, a cul-de-sac. That is the story of a historical tragedy, but it is not the whole story. That is what makes the, quote, other Trotskyists, end quote, the heterodox, so important for the future revolutionary socialist politics. In parallel to and polemic with the Orthodox on issue after issue, and in general they elaborated politics of consistent anti-Stalinism as well as consistent anti-capitalism. Where the Orthodox built on Trotsky's mistakes at the end of his life, the Heterodox built on the whole record of Trotskyist anti-Stalinism and anti-capitalism. The Heterodox, too, were organizationally scattered and dispersed, even more radically so than the Orthodox. The surprising thing is not their setbacks, but that they were able to do the work they did for 2 decades and more. Their political legacy, not that of the more numerous and seemingly more successful Orthodox, is one on which a renewal of revolutionary Marxism is possible. In history, revolutionary movements suffer defeat and again defeat. That is the nature of things for movements confronting the entrenched might and power of ruling classes. There are no words of explanation and consolation that can make that historical reality less bitter. But the movement continues because the bourgeois oppression, to which revolutionary socialism is the opposite, and the antidote continues. The defeated bear their defeat honorably and work to prepare the future. Brave young people pick up the fallen banners. They try to learn from the past. To learn from the past, we must know the past. To renew and build on the history of the Trotskyist movement, it is necessary to know that history. It is necessary to know the whole heritage, to know that, important as the Orthodox organizations are, theirs has not been the only strand of Trotskyism, or the best. The Heterodox are pivotal in the history of Trotskyism and in its future. Don't mourn, study, think, and organize, or as James Connolly used to put it, hope and fight! Exclamation point. New section. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which had distant origins as, quote, 1953, end quote, that is, sharply anti-Stalinist, quote, Canaanites, end quote, made our way to the third camp politics of the heterodox Trotskyist tradition by our responses to successive political events rather than by way of a sudden conversion. Then we revised our ideas about the history of the Trotskyist movement. We, quote, went back to 1940, end quote, to the parting of the ways of the two main Trotskyist currents. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty has for practical purposes, that is, in our political responses to events, become in the heterodox Trotskyist camp, has been in the heterodox Trotskyist camp since the late 1970s, though some formal explanations and changes of, quote, position, end quote, were made later. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan in December 1970, and our decision to argue for the withdrawal of USSR troops, alone of Orthodox Trotskyist organizations, is a convenient point from which to date our allegiance to the, quote, third camp, end quote, tradition. Despite its vicissitudes and despite the fact that it does not come down to us as a neatly codified package transmitted by a continuous chain of organizational and intellectual activity, that tradition and the formulations of its politics form a rich heritage, as well as the political disputes, mistakes, and degenerations. There is also a magnificent record of indomitable devotion and courage in the fight for socialism against both capitalism and Stalinism. In this volume, Volume 1, And Volume 3. Oh, there's going to be a Volume 3. Fun. In the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1. This volume, Volume 1 and Volume 3. New section. In the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, available on this channel. All the pieces are read and ready to, are going to be, there's going to be like one entry a week for like the next year or so. Or not for the next year, but like probably the next 6 months, I mean. And including this piece, it might very well be closer to a year. In the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, I assembled key texts of a strand of Trotskyist thinking which had been confined to the archives of for many decades. The, quote, heterodox Trotskyism, end quote, of Max Shachtman, Hal Draper, C.L.R. James, Al Glotzer, and others. This volume continues that work of rediscovery. It documents the fact that the characteristic ideas of later, quote, Orthodox Trotskyism, end quote, objectively revolutionary, end quote, Stalinism, socialist revolution by, quote, bureaucratic impulse, end quote, or by Stalinists being, quote, compelled, end quote, by circumstances, the supposed self-sufficiency of a, quote, party, end quote, apparatus with an allegedly, quote, finished, end quote, program, the fetishizations of some formulas of Trotsky, such as the USSR was a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, had developed within a year or so of Trotsky's death in 1940, though it took another decade for them to develop into a lockdown system. It makes the case that revolutionary socialists today who want to find clean political ground on which to rebuild in labor movements, where seepage from many decades of Stalinism still poisons the ground, must go back to re-examine the old debates and the flaws and lacunae in the political legacy which Trotsky left at his death, back to 1940. My original plan was to cover all the important disputes and debates that helped form the two basic strands of the Trotskyist movement in one sizable volume. That proved impossible. There will be a third and final volume. Important issues are being held back for the third volume, most notably perhaps on the Trotskyist and the Jewish question in the period of the Holocaust. In producing this volume, I owe much to Martin Thomas for suggestions and insights, and for much discussion and argument for the index and preprint technical work, and to Gemma Short for technical work. Sean Matgamna, October 2015. That's the end of the introduction. The notes, there's some endnotes here. It's only a couple pages, so I'm going to read them. Endnote 1. Dual power would mean the working class may be expressing itself through workers' councils, parentheses, Soviets, end parentheses, so strong that they vied directly with the government for political and social control, the disintegration, enfeeblement, and paralysis of the bourgeois state, and the coming into being of a rising and strengthening working class movement with authority comparable to that of the state, as in Russia before the October Revolution. 2. In fact, the policy adopted on Trotsky's initiative in mid-1939 of championing the independence of a, quote, Soviet Ukraine, endnote 2. In fact, the policy adopted on Trotsky's initiative in mid-1939 of championing the independence of a, quote, Soviet Ukraine, end quote, against Moscow rule implied that the USSR was an empire in the sense that pre-World War I Austro-Hungary was, and in the 1930s the Trotskyists defined Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia as imperialist states. States with national minorities held against their will. Ukraine vanished from the Socialist Workers' Party press during the war. Endnote 3. On the lines of Lenin's and Trotsky's arguments in World War I, the strongest argument against, quote, defending, end quote, or siding with Britain, the Britain of the labor movement and the trade unions, against the Nazis would be Britain's alliance with the USSR, the real Stalinist USSR, not the imaginary one that still, for Cannon and his comrades, shone with the glow of the October Revolution. 4. It is a strange fact of history that the serious and detailed critical accounts of Stalinist society available in the West in the 1930s were mostly limited to the works of Trotsky and Trotsky's comrades, and those of disillusioned ex-sympathizers of the Communist Party. In Britain, It was a, quote, right book club, end quote, run by the publisher Hutchinson's, a weak parallel to the very strong, quote, left book club, end quote, of Victor Galanch and the Communist Party, that published Victor Serge's book on Russia, Eugene Lyon's Assignment in Utopia, and I Was a Soviet Worker by Andrew Smith, parenthesis, a sympathizer who went to the USSR, end parenthesis. In the era of the great capitalist slump, there was eager sympathy for, quote, the Russian experiment, end quote, among liberals and reformed socialists and even some aristocratic Tories. There was a tremendous wide credulity for the Stalinist account of USSR society. The New Statesman and Tribune, like The Nation and New Republic in the USA, were Stalinist propaganda sheets on everything connected with Russia. 5. The post-Hitler Stalin-packed pro-German defeatism of the strong French Communist Party had, of course, been a factor in that. See, I don't know what any of these are referring to. 6. The open letter 2. The appeal to Stalin as if to an errant comrade in arms was a precedent. Similar appeals to Stalinists in power in Yugoslavia, the USSR, China, etc. would punctuate the later political history of the Orthodox, like interjections from a victim of political Tourette syndrome. Endnote 7. Richard Overy, Russia's War, a book, Chapter 5, Antony Beevor's Stalingrad, and Antony Beevor's Berlin. You know, since I'm at the end of it and I don't feel like rushed or anything, I'm going to look up some of these books while we're here. Russia's War by Richard Overy, The History of the Soviet Effort from 1941 to 1945. Says, the description of the book says, the Russian war effort to defeat invading Axis powers, an effort that assembled the largest military force in recorded history, and that cost the lives of more than 25 million Soviet soldiers and civilians, was the decisive factor for securing an Allied victory. Now with access to the wealth of film archives and interview material from Russia used to produce the 10-hour television documentary Russia's War, Richard Overy tackles the many persuasive questions surrounding the conflict. Was Stalin a military genius? Was the defense of Mother Russia a product of something greater than numbers of tanks and planes, or something deep within the Russian soul? So that's Russia's War. I'd like to watch that documentary series. That seems very interesting. What were the other books? Antony Beevor, Stalingrad. Beevor Stalingrad has actually a Wikipedia page, which is surprising. Stalingrad is a narrative history written by Antony Beevor of the battle fought in and around the city of Stalingrad during World War II, as well as the events leading up to it. It was first published by Viking Press in 1998. The book won the first Samuel Johnson Prize, the Wolfson History Prize, and the Hal Thornton Prize for Literature in 1999. Content. The book starts with Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the subsequent drive into the Soviet Union. Its main focus is the Battle of Stalingrad, in particular, the period from the initial German attack to Operation Uranus and the Soviet victory. It details the subsequent battles and war crimes committed by both sides. The book ends with the defeat and surrender of the Germans in February 1943 and the beginning of the Soviet advance on Germany. Beevor returned to the subject in his 2002 book, Berlin, The Downfall, 1945. Publication. Stalingrad was published in the Philippines under the title of Stalingrad, The Fateful Siege, 1942-43, and has been translated into 18 languages. The English paperback version was published by Penguin in 1999. Won't read more than that. 1 second. Berlin, downfall of 1945 also has a Wikipedia page. Berlin, downfall 1945, also known as the Fall of Berlin 1945, is a narrative history by Antony Beevor of the Battle of Berlin during World War II. It was published by Viking Press in 2002, then later by Penguin Books in 2003. The book achieved both critical and commercial success. It has been a #1 bestseller in 7 countries apart from Britain, and in top 5 in another 9 countries. Together, this book and Beevor's Stalingrad, first published in 1998, has sold nearly 3 million copies. Contents. The book revisits the events of the Battle of Berlin in 1945 and narrates how the Red Army defeated the Wehrmacht and brought an end to Hitler's Third Reich, as well as an end to the war in Europe. The book was accompanied by a BBC Time Watch program on Beevor's research into the subject. Back to the text. Footnote, or I'll read that next endnote now. During World War II, the Communist Party USA would have 100,000 members at its peak and great strength in the trade unions. Endnote 9. And what of communists who want to overthrow the autocracy, but might not be willing to subordinate themselves meekly to Stalin in the war, or join the Orthodox in their pledges of loyalty? If the Canaanites ruled in Russia, the, quote, petty bourgeois renegades, end quote, of the Workers' Party would be outlawed. They wouldn't qualify for release from Stalin's jails. 10. I'm don't know what these are in reference to, so it would have been better to have duplicated this PDF and had one section opened to the endnotes and another to the text. But this just is another, it goes to show that footnotes are superior to endnotes. 10. The militants' proposal of the Socialist United States of Europe as an immediate alternative to the war seemed to take the existing German Empire as a given starting point, ignoring the conquered European peoples and their national rights and possible inclinations. That might have been rooted in Trotsky's 1915 peace program, in which he argued that if Germany united Europe, then socialists should fight within that Europe for its transformation into a democratic federation. It is plain in hindsight that Trotsky underestimated the upsurge of nationalism that conquest would trigger in the forcibly, quote, united, end quote, nations of Europe. The caricature of Trotsky's 1915 ideas in the press of the Orthodox in World War II was an aspect of their blindness towards the national liberation movements that would develop in some of the Nazi-occupied territories. It seems like, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like Trotsky's ideas on the national question seem pretty similar to Rosa Luxemburg's. Rosa Luxemburg did not support the dismantling of the Russian Empire into a bunch of separate national democracies or something like that. She believed that I think she believed, at least I don't want to misrepresent her ideas, but at least I think she believed that she basically just kind of believed that there should be a unity of politics between, say, she didn't really care about, or she felt that it was reactionary to advocate for individual nation states, and that what should be supported would be I believe at least the transformation of the existing Russian Empire into one existing socialist state. I believe. I'm not sure. I could be talking out my ass. And so at the outbreak of war in 1939 did the Nazis. They issued an appeal to the working class of the world in the form of a call from Robert Ley, Gauleiter of Hitler's police state, quote, unions. In Britain, that appeal was reprinted in the press of the anti-war but often confused Independent Labour Party. Robert Ley, who lived from 1890 to 1945, was a German politician during the Nazi era who headed the German Labor Front during its entire existence, from 1933 to 1945. Robert Ley also held many other high positions in the German Nazi Party, including Gauleiter, Reichsleiter, and Reichsorganisationsleiter. Robert Ley committed suicide in 1945 while awaiting trial at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Back to the text. Endnote 12. This sort of mental operation would be a model for many other political rationalizations in the future, for instance, to explain how Mao Zedong's peasant army could make a working-class revolution in China as they believed it had. 13. The lack of internal party critics with enough self-confidence to call the Socialist Workers' Party leaders to order also contributed. It was sometimes said approvingly of Stalin's USSR in World War II that it had no disloyal, quote, fifth column, end quote, because all the, quote, fifth columnists, end quote, had been shot. James Buchanan, too, faced no revolt or, quote, fifth column, end quote, in his ranks because, politically speaking, he had shot them. Endnote 14. These important critics from within Orthodox Trotskyism, as it took shape, themselves fell down before the contradictions and difficulties of the time. Goldman and some of Goldman's co-thinkers joined the Workers' Party in June 1946. Goldman remained active until 1948 when he left the Workers' Party, differing with them about the Marshall Plan of U.S. aid to Europe. Goldman was for it, end parenthesis. Goldman then quit political activity. Morrow did not leave the Socialist Workers' Party with Goldman. Morrow was expelled in November 1946 and left politics at that point. Another significant critic, Louis Jacobs, distributed his document, quote, "We arrive at a line," end quote, in late 1944 and then dropped out of the Socialist Workers' Party, writing occasionally for the Workers' Party press. Jean van Huysenoort, wartime secretary of the New York-based Fourth International, dropped out too. Endnote 15. See Trotsky's letter to Borodai of late 1928, that's going to be on the channel, in which he defined political reformability as the criterion of a workers' state, and Shachtman's discussion of Trotsky's later shift to nationalized property as the empirical criteria. See Fate of Russian Revolution, Volume 1, which is going to be on this channel. Endnote 16. At least one Trotskyist tendency, lutte ouvrière, argued right up until the end that Stalinist Russia had one class character and the structurally identical satellites another. Endnote 17. In Posadas, the patterns of 1940 to 45 and of the war revolution perspective of 1950 to 54 were up front. After all, if war revolution would be a stage forward towards socialism, as the Fourth International in 1951 to 53 had believed, then serious socialists should indeed advocate it. Sometime in the 1970s, the author listened to a British Posadist exulting in the, quote, transformations, end quote, and, quote, regeneration, end quote, that had taken place in the USSR. He cited tremendous working-class gatherings and marches in Moscow. Hadn't we heard? No. What had happened? What working-class demonstrations? It turned out he was talking about the annual official Stalinist May Day march and military display. Jesus Christ. Endnote 18. In 1953, Cannon indicted Pablo, Mandel, etc. for thinking that the Russian state could project, quote, a roughly revolutionary orientation, end quote, in the imminent Third World War, and which would be a war revolution. Endnote 19. Alexander's accounts of Trotskyist movements in the two countries I know about in some detail because I have been active in them, the UK and Ireland, are not even a reliable chronology. Even such a, quote, standard, end quote, work as Isaac Deutscher's biography of Trotsky fails, at least in its third volume, which tells the stories of Trotsky's last exile after 1929. Deutscher radically misrepresents Trotsky's views on Stalinism at the end of his life by, quote, splitting, end quote, Trotsky into two, assigning views that were Trotsky's to other anti-Stalinists whom he fought with, and narrowing Trotsky down to something not too far from Deutscher's own critical pro-Stalinist politics. This is just a side note from myself. It seems like... never mind, actually, no side note for myself. Finally, it says, our thanks to Marty Goodman, the Ryazanov Library Project, and the Marxist Internet Archive for their work in making many of the text used here more accessible and available. Most of the non-Trotsky quotations are from text in this volume. They may include cuts not indicated by ellipses which can be identified with the full text. The texts have the old usage of, quote, man, end quote, for, quote, human being, end quote, quote, he, for, quote, he or she, end quote, etc. That reflects their times rather than indifference by the speakers and writers to women's liberation. All right, so that's the end of the introduction to The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, Volume 2. The two Trotskyisms confront Stalinism. Thanks for listening.